In 1940, a classified document numbered 21 was secretly signed in Berlin. This seemingly ordinary military directive nearly plunged the entire world into the darkest abyss in human history. It was none other than the Operation Barbarossa plan, personally signed by Hitler himself. In this account, you'll discover why Hitler believed Germany absolutely had to launch this seemingly insane war in 1941. You'll learn about 3 secret plans buried deep in historical archives, plans that, if successfully implemented, would have cost over 100 million lives, 3 times more than the known total casualties of World War II. Even more shocking, you'll see how Hitler drew evil inspiration from America's westward expansion, how he used pseudoscientific theories to convince all of Germany to participate in this unprecedented population control campaign, and why Germany's economic predicament made this invasion inevitable. Most importantly, you'll understand why the failure of Operation Barbarossa may have been one of the luckiest events in human history. Because if Germany had truly conquered the Soviet Union in 1941, the world we live in today would be completely different. But first, we need to start with a fact that everyone has misunderstood. For decades, people have believed that invading the Soviet Union was Hitler's greatest strategic mistake. This widely accepted view has completely misled us. Barbarossa was far from an impulsive, crazy decision. It was Hitler's ultimate plan, carefully crafted since the 1920s. As early as 1925, when Mein Kampf was published, Hitler clearly declared, "Germany's destiny lies in the East." This wasn't some vague political slogan, but a detailed blueprint for conquest. He painted the Soviet Union's vast territories as Germany's living space and viewed the hundreds of millions of residents there as obstacles that had to be eliminated. The moment Hitler seized power in 1933, the first top-secret directive he signed was, immediately begin preparations for conquering the East. German military industries started secretly expanding production lines. The finest generals worked day and night studying Soviet terrain and climate, while diplomatic departments busied themselves finding reasonable excuses for the future invasion. This unprecedented war preparation work continued silently for a full 8 years. Every military contract, every military exercise, every diplomatic move was preparing for that fatal moment in summer 1941. But why was Hitler so obsessed with this seemingly impossible, crazy mission? The real answer lies hidden in a set of shocking numbers that were deliberately concealed. In 1940, Germany appeared incredibly powerful on the surface, having conquered most of Europe. But a top-secret economic report revealed a starkly different reality. Germany's GDP was only 1/4 of America's, and its industrial capacity didn't even match the combined output of Britain and the United States. More deadly was Germany's agricultural situation. At the time, 30% of Germany's population was still engaged in agriculture, while Britain had less than 10%. What did this mean? Germany's agricultural efficiency was only half that of Britain's, unable to feed its rapidly growing population. Every year, Germany needed to import over 4 million tons of grain from overseas to avoid famine, and the British naval blockade was making this increasingly difficult. Germany's grain reserves were plummeting. By winter 1940, Germany's food stockpiles could only last 4 months. If they couldn't secure new food sources before summer 1941, Germany would face nationwide famine. The Ukrainian plains of the Soviet Union, that black soil region known as Europe's breadbasket, became Germany's only lifeline. Hitler's choice was simple: either expand eastward or wait to die. But his reasons for choosing the Eastern campaign were far more complex and evil than simple survival needs. He wanted to completely replicate history's most successful expansion model, and the prototype for this model came from across the ocean, from America. Hitler had a contradictory and pathological obsession with America. On one hand, he despised America's democratic system and multicultural society. On the other hand, he deeply envied America's tremendous success through westward expansion. In Hitler's unpublished second book, he described in detail his study of America's Western development. He believed that by occupying Native American lands, America had become a world power. This success model was deeply imprinted in Hitler's mind. Hitler often told his generals, "What the Americans did in the West, we're going to do again in the East." In his imagination, the Soviet Union's Slavic peoples were Germany's Indians, Ukraine's plains were Germany's Texas, and Siberia's resources were Germany's California gold mines. This wasn't metaphorical, it was literal imitation. Hitler even ordered his planners to study America's westward routes, preparing to replicate the same expansion model in Eastern Europe. He wanted to establish a Germanic empire, stretching from Berlin to the Ural Mountains, just as America stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific. But the American model was only part of Hitler's evil plan. Darker motives lay ahead. Hitler firmly believed Germany was surrounded by a massive conspiracy. In his paranoid worldview, Jews controlled America's financial system, Bolsheviks controlled the Soviet Union's political system, and Britain was the European stronghold of this international conspiracy. This feeling of being surrounded wasn't entirely delusional. Germany was indeed in an unfavorable geographic position. The Anglo-French alliance to the west, the Soviet Union to the east, and unreliable ally Italy to the south. Germany lacked natural resources. Oil had to be imported from Romania, iron ore from Sweden, and grain from Eastern Europe. But Hitler twisted this realistic geopolitical predicament into a racial conspiracy theory. He believed that only through a racial war that completely eliminated the inferior races of the East could Germany achieve true security. This wasn't ordinary territorial expansion, but a colonial war aimed at racial genocide. The Nazi propaganda machine began day and night indoctrination of the German people with this ideology. The Soviet Union was no longer described as an enemy nation, but as an infected zone that needed to be completely cleansed. The roots of this thinking can be traced back to a forgotten piece of German history from World War I. Few people know that Germany briefly realized its Eastern expansion dream during World War I. In March 1918, Germany signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with revolutionary Soviet Russia, gaining vast territories in Poland, the Baltic states, and Ukraine. Within just a few months, Germany established a colonial government called the Supreme Command East and began implementing racial policies in these territories. Local Slavic populations were forcibly relocated, German immigrants began pouring in, and local resources were massively extracted and shipped back to Germany. This early living space experiment brought Germany enormous economic benefits. From Ukraine alone, Germany obtained enough grain to feed all of Germany. Germany's military industry also rapidly expanded due to acquiring large amounts of iron ore and coal. But this Eastern Empire quickly collapsed with Germany's defeat on the Western Front. In November 1918, Germany was forced to withdraw from all occupied territories, and millions of German immigrants were forced to return to Germany. This brief, golden age became a collective memory for Germany's military and political circles, and also became the historical basis for Hitler's Eastern campaign plan. Hitler often told his generals, "We did it once before, and this time we're going to do it better and more thoroughly." To create public opinion for the coming racial war, the Nazi government mobilized Germany's entire intellectual community. Hundreds of so-called racial scientists began manufacturing theoretical justifications, proving that Germans were naturally superior while Slavs were naturally inferior. German bookstores in the 1930s were filled with various scientific works. These books used beautiful illustrations to contrast pure Germanic youth with degenerate Jewish youth, used fabricated maps to show Jewish-instigated world revolution, and used manufactured data to prove the intellectual deficiencies of Slavic peoples. The most vicious was a propaganda pamphlet called Subhumans, which was distributed in millions of copies throughout Germany. This pamphlet depicted the Soviet Union as a subhuman zoo ruled by Jewish Bolsheviks, claiming that the inhabitants there could no longer be considered truly human. The effect of this propaganda was astonishing. By 1941, most German soldiers believed they were about to face not ordinary enemies, but vermin that needed to be completely exterminated. German military internal documents explicitly instructed soldiers, "This is not an ordinary war, but a life-and-death struggle of race and ideology." But what finally made Hitler decide was Germany's increasingly deteriorating military balance. In 1940, Germany seemingly held absolute military superiority. But secret reports submitted by Hitler's military advisors revealed a completely different picture. Germany's military advantage was rapidly disappearing. The numbers were brutal. In 1941, Germany's aircraft production was 11,000 units, while Britain produced 20,000 units, and the United States provided another 5,000 through the Lend-Lease Act. In tank production, Germany produced 5,200 tanks for the entire year, while the Soviet Union alone produced 6,400. More terrifying was America's industrial mobilization speed. American aircraft production was growing at 50% annually, tank production at 80% annually. Following this trend, by the end of 1942, Germany would face enemies 10 times its strength. Hitler's armaments minister Albert Speer recalled after the war, "The Führer often summoned us for meetings deep into the night, always discussing the same question: how much time do we have left?" Every production report reminded us that Germany was running out of time. In spring 1941, German intelligence intercepted secret communications between Britain and America, revealing that the two countries were planning to open a second front in Europe in 1942. This meant Germany would soon face the nightmare of fighting on two fronts. Hitler realized that if he couldn't resolve the Soviet problem in 1941, Germany would never have another chance. But his decision was far more evil than simple military adventure. The Soviet Union possessed everything Germany desperately needed: oil, iron ore, grain, and tens of millions of people who could be enslaved. More importantly, the Soviet Union was the lifeline of Germany's wartime economy. Under the 1939 Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the Soviet Union annually provided Germany with 1 million tons of oil, 1.6 million tons of grain, and large quantities of iron ore. Without these supplies, Germany's war machine would immediately stop functioning. But this dependency made Hitler extremely uneasy. Hitler told his generals in a secret meeting, "We're now like a starving man, living off the charity of our enemies. This situation cannot continue." He feared that Stalin would cut off supplies at a critical moment, leaving Germany in desperate straits. What terrified Hitler even more was the Soviet Union's increasingly strong military capabilities. Soviet military industry was rapidly developing, producing more and more weapons each year. Hitler's intelligence services predicted that if given 2 years, the Soviet Union would have the world's most powerful army. Faced with this situation, Hitler reached a crazy conclusion. Rather than wait for the Soviet Union to become stronger, why not launch a surprise attack now and seize all of the Soviet Union's resources in one stroke? This way, Germany could not only solve its resource problems, but also eliminate its greatest threat. But Hitler's true goals were far more evil than seizing resources. Operation Barbarossa was not just a military invasion, but the beginning of 3 interconnected population control plans. The scale of these 3 plans exceeded the limits of human imagination. The first plan was the well-known final solution, the systematic elimination of European Jews. But few people know that this plan was originally just a small part of a much larger operation. The second plan was called Generalplan Ost, aimed at emptying all of Eastern Europe of its native inhabitants. This plan required the forced relocation of 30 to 40 million Slavs within 20 years, making room for 10 million German immigrants. The plan's architects knew full well that forced relocation on this scale was equivalent to mass extermination. The third plan was the most cruel hunger plan. This plan required German forces to systematically plunder all of the Soviet Union's food supplies, artificially creating famine that would kill 20 to 30 million Soviet residents. The plan's details were horrifying. All grain was to be shipped to Germany, all livestock was to be transported away, and not even seeds could be left for the local population. These 3 plans combined were expected to result in at least 60 million deaths, more than the actual losses of the entire Second World War. Hitler personally approved these plans and instructed, "These measures are absolutely necessary for the survival of the German nation." SS Chief Heinrich Himmler personally oversaw the creation of Generalplan Ost, the most detailed blueprint for racial genocide in human history. This plan wasn't abstract theory, but an operational manual specific to every village. The plan stipulated that 85% of Poles were to be eliminated, 50% of Czechs were to be eliminated, 65% of Ukrainians were to be eliminated, and 50% of Russians were to be eliminated. The remainder would be forcibly relocated to concentration camps in Siberia, where they would perform slave labor until death. The plan even detailed the settlement patterns for German immigrants. Each German farm would occupy 125 hectares, with 20 Slavic slave families serving them. German immigrants would live in armed fortresses, ready at all times to suppress local resistance. Most evil was the arrangement for children. The plan stipulated that all Slavic children under 10 years old would be forcibly brought to Germany for racial screening. Children with Germanic characteristics would be adopted by German families, while the rest would be sent to concentration camps. In secret instructions to his subordinates, Himmler wrote, "We must harden our hearts. For the future of the German nation, we must do what others cannot do." Implementation of this plan had already begun, but more immediate death threats came from the Hunger Plan. The Hunger Plan was the masterpiece of German Food Minister Herbert Backe. The plan's logic was simple and cruel. Since Germany needed food, let the Soviets starve and take their food. The plan's details were chilling. German forces would occupy all of the Soviet Union's food-producing regions, confiscate all stored grain, and prohibit locals from growing any crops. All meat, dairy products, and even vegetables would be shipped to Germany. Locals would only receive minimal potatoes and black bread, just enough to prevent immediate starvation, but sufficient to cause gradual weakening over several months. More malicious still, the plan required German forces to deliberately destroy Soviet agricultural infrastructure. All tractors were to be destroyed, all fertilizer plants were to be bombed, and even farming tools were to be confiscated. This way, even if the war ended, the Soviet Union would be unable to restore agricultural production. In his report to Hitler, Backe wrote, "Through this plan, we can reduce the Soviet population by 1/3 within 2 years, making sufficient room for German immigrants." When Hitler approved this plan, he said, "Hunger is our best weapon. Bullets run out, but hunger never does." Implementation of this plan led to one of the most severe man-made famines in human history. The most direct victims of the Hunger Plan were Soviet prisoners of war. Germany captured approximately 5.8 million Soviet soldiers, of whom over 3 million died in German POW camps. This wasn't accidental, it was a carefully orchestrated operation. The instructions given to German forces were explicit. Soviet POWs were not protected by international law and could be disposed of at will. POW camps deliberately failed to provide adequate food, giving prisoners only 1 bowl of thin gruel and 1 slice of moldy bread per day. Prisoners were forced to perform the most grueling labor and received no medical care when sick. Most cruel was the screening operation. German forces would regularly select Jews, communists, and intellectuals from among the prisoners for special treatment. The remaining prisoners slowly weakened under terrible conditions. A German officer wrote in his diary, "Every morning we have to remove many dead from the barracks. These people look like skeletons when they died, nothing but skin and bones. But our superiors told us this was necessary because every dead Russian saved Germany 1 ration of food." Some POW camps had extremely low survival rates. In one camp holding 100,000 prisoners, only 5,000 were still alive after 9 months. This systematic elimination operation served as a rehearsal for the larger-scale population control to come. Historians, through studying Nazi archives, have reconstructed the terrible consequences if Operation Barbarossa had succeeded. If Germany had truly captured Moscow before winter 1941, humanity would have faced the greatest disaster in history. First, the Hunger Plan would have been fully implemented. The Soviet Union's food-producing regions would have been completely plundered, causing massive famine. Historians estimate that this alone would have caused 30 million deaths. Second, Generalplan Ost would have begun large-scale implementation. Tens of millions of Slavs would have been forcibly relocated to concentration camps in Siberia. Those deemed valuable would have been used for slave labor until death. Third, the Jewish final solution would have extended throughout the Soviet Union. The Nazis planned to eliminate approximately 5 million Jews within Soviet territory, plus other groups deemed undesirable. The number of victims would have been astronomical. More terrifying still, a successful Operation Barbarossa would have given Germany sufficient resources to continue the war. With Soviet oil, grain, and minerals, Germany would have been able to simultaneously fight Britain and the United States. World War II might have continued into the 1950s, with casualties potentially exceeding 100 million. Fortunately, most of these horrific plans were never realized. The failure of Operation Barbarossa not only saved the Soviet Union, but also saved the entire world. The German army's defeat outside Moscow meant that those evil population control plans could not be fully implemented. When German forces became bogged down in the Soviet quagmire, Hitler was forced to divert massive resources to military operations, and the extreme plans were delayed or scaled back. Although the Nazis still implemented the final solution, both Generalplan Ost and the Hunger Plan failed to reach their intended scale. The victory at Stalingrad completely shattered Germany's eastern expansion dreams. Germany not only failed to obtain Soviet resources, but also consumed its most elite forces on the Eastern Front. By 1943, Germany had lost any possibility of winning the war. The failure at Stalingrad marked the complete bankruptcy of Operation Barbarossa. Those once carefully planned Generalplan Ost and Hunger Plan documents began to be quietly destroyed. In 1945, in a Berlin bunker, Hitler departed this world. Those safes filled with classified documents were still burning, including that Directive 21 signed in 1940. From signing to burning, over 1,600 days and nights. This secret document that was supposed to change the world ultimately changed only one thing. It destroyed the empire that signed it. Barbarossa failed, but its failure saved the world.